Before we do a deep dive into the six capitals, I want to share with you some economic theory. It's called the economic theory of the firm. Please keep this in the back of your mind as we discuss the six capitals later. Economic theory of the firm or enterprise is known as resource-based theory. In this resource-based economic theory, it's about what really matters to stakeholders of the firm. These are the strategic resources of the firm that create value for the firm. They do not, in most cases, appear in the financials of the firm. There are perhaps 5 essential attributes that characterize these strategic resources. We're going to take a look at them later. We'll discuss each in their role in creating value for the firm. As stewards and corporate fiduciaries, in order to think through how the firm creates value, you'll need to think about the strategic resources of the enterprise. We will discuss later these resources as the 6 capitals, but this is the theory and strategy behind their importance. In fact, it is the product and creation of Baruch Lev. Just as background, Baruch Lev is a brilliant market economist, professor at NYU's Graduate Business School. He's the author of 11 books and just one published entitled The End of Accounting and the Path Forward for Investors and Managers. I recently interviewed Baruch for an article that I did in the CPA Journal. And while I don't want this to sound like a module from an MBA course, I did want to share Baruch's thinking and his unique perspective of the new role and future responsibility of fiduciaries and stewards within the corporate enterprise, how you can help create value for the firm. When we look at the 6 capitals, we're then going to look at it from the strategic perspective of resource management, of the strategic resources, from the perspective of a brilliant professor who spent his lifetime trying to convert disciples to his thinking. A critic once commented on Richard Wagner's music, "It's not as bad as it sounds." Well, according to Baruch Lev, financial information, the quarterly and annual reports, currently contribute only 5 to 6% of the information needed and used by shareholders to make decisions. So effectively, according to Lev, it is actually worse than it sounds. According to Baruch, accounting has lost its relevance. But the issue still remains. How can a company measure its impact on people, profit, and planet, those externalities? And can they even be measured with any degree of reliability or in any uniform manner across peer companies as, say, revenues are? Baruch postulates, he says, just think about the raging controversies about the extent of climate change and the widely different measures used to measure the climate: sea level, glaciers, glacial volume, surface temperature, and imagine reflecting all of this in some kind of corporate report or internal corporate report. And even if we can measure these changes, will managers, corporate compliance, risk management professionals, will they be willing to report this information that likely exposes them to endless harassment and litigation? Would you hazard a guess on the impact of a 1% rise in greenhouse gas emissions, say on future sales if you were working for Conagra or a seed company or another agribusiness? So let's follow Baruch's logic and some of his conclusions. According to Lev, there is no single magic number, no bottom line or even triple bottom line, that is the people, planet, profit lines, that we can use to measure strategic resources. From his perspective, analyzing a complex and often global business entity subject to competition and fast-changing technologies requires a comprehensive system of well-integrated indicators and contextual information. According to Lev, it's a mosaic. There are no shortcuts. And that is what your challenge will be as a new corporate stewards and fiduciaries. So as we know, critics don't build anything. So here's what Baruch calls our new corporate mission. And while it's quite radical in its approach, it builds on basic economic theory, the theory of the firm and the organization. So here's how it goes according to Lev. And I'm quoting from a few segments of his new book, which he was gracious enough to allow me to do. He also gave me an advanced copy of his book, so the final chapters may be a bit different. According to Baruch, the major objective of a business enterprise is to strive to gain sustained competitive advantage. Such advantage over rivals assures adequate return to investors, workforce employment, and long-term survival of the enterprise for the customer's benefit. What we need to ignore, says Lev, are the one-offs, the short-term thinking such as financial gimmicks, buybacks, corporate acquisitions, earnings manipulation, but to focus on achieving sustained competitive advantage. This is really the fundamental long-term objective of business enterprise. It is what really matters to the stakeholders. Now, personally, I think this is really important as you assume your new roles. Ask yourself, in the enterprise that you work, how can your enterprise create sustained economic profits? In fact, you'll find yourself suggesting that the resources and assets on the balance sheet, office buildings, production machinery, appliances, airplanes, inventory, the assets which currently populate the corporate balance sheet cannot create competitive advantage. These are just commodities. They're available to all competitors. None of these things matter to companies like Pfizer. Their laboratory equipment is not superior to their competitors. So the conclusion that Baruch Lev reaches are that the resources, these input factors that enable value creation, are strategic resources of the enterprise, and they all share three attributes. Number one, they are valuable. They contribute to the stream of benefits, like patents and trademarks and brand loyalty and reputation. And we're going to go in depth in some of these areas in one of the six capitals, the intellectual property and intangibles. Number two, they're rare. A limited amount of these assets exist, like the wireless spectrum, landing rights, gates at airports. And three, they're difficult to imitate. Competitors cannot easily acquire or develop them quickly. Think how many real competitors there are to Google. Think how many have really tried to catch up. So here are the five key KPIs, key performance indicators, or what Baruch calls useful attributes that are the key to creating value for the firm, as well as to understand the critical success factors that stakeholders need to understand about the firm. Attribute one, and these are things that you're going to need to identify as corporate compliance professionals, as risk managers, as fiduciaries, as stewards of the new corporation. Attribute one, we're going to need to identify the strategic assets, the intangibles, the hidden assets, including their characteristics, their value, and related attributes such as, for example, at Procter & Gamble, the number of patents in the company's portfolio, the patents supporting products and services, the number of patents licensed out, patent quality, some protection mechanisms against infringement, and others. According to Lev, mapping to strategic resources is a critical link in the value creation strategy of the firm. A second attribute or KPI, can you even identify how the strategic investments are being spent? Does R&D, as currently reported in the income statement, really correlate at all with brand creation, brand maintenance, technology acquisition, employee training, intelligent workforce, consulting work on business processes, media content creation, IT support of business processes? Are these expenses of the business, or are they investments in the business? And how can they be reported differently? And financially, can you even measure their effectiveness and efficiency? Attribute three, as corporate fiduciaries and stewards, can you focus on how to preserve and renew the strategic resources of the enterprise? In this connection, Baruch Lev discusses threats to strategic investments. For example, competitors infringing on your assets. Every year there are thousands of patent and trademark infringement suits which attest to the vulnerability of many of the strategic assets by your rivals. And the second, which is even more problematic and something that is absolutely critical that you take into consideration, and many corporations have ignored this at their peril, that is disruption. Again, not measured, but innovation diminishes or replaces widely used technologies. This is a far greater enterprise risk than anything measured on a balance sheet. And I can tell you, in my role as business development professional at Wolters Kluwer, we always looked at competition, and then we looked at competitive positioning, and then defensive positioning. How would we react if something like that occurred in the marketplace that was a rival? This is a far greater enterprise risk than anything measured on a balance sheet. As Lev argues, the corporate graveyard is strewn with enterprises whose major technology was disrupted by others. And think of the companies like Kodak, Atari, Western Union, and all the mom-and-pop stores that were replaced by Walmart. Think of online travel and booking agencies. And then if you identify the threat, because that's one of your responsibilities in maintaining and creating value for the corporate enterprise, if you identify these threats, what are the defensive measures that you're going to take? On the other side, included in the preservation of strategic assets are your creative efforts to slow down the obsolescence, according to Lev. Brand decay without continuous maintenance by advertising and social media. TV series need sequels. Patents need to be enhanced or slightly improved. These are the ways to preserve the strategic assets to slow down their obsolescence. As Lev says, the battle against resource obsolescence should be a continuous and integral part of the business model of the enterprise. Now, where does this appear in any enterprise risk management program in any school in America? The battle against resource obsolescence as a continuous and integral part of the business model of the enterprise. And where does it appear in the corporate boardrooms? Where does that process live? Who's responsible for that process within the corporation? But as stewards of the corporate enterprise, you have to identify or at least question what your role is in protecting against the obsolescence of strategic assets. And my question is, in risk management or corporate compliance or regulatory or fiduciary areas, will you take the offensive on this, or will you take a defensive position? And what are the consequences of going on the offense? What are the consequences of going on the defense as you report these issues to your CEO or to your senior executives? Attribute 4, strategic deployment. According to Lev, the specific deployment of strategic assets will determine the firm's current and, most important, future performance. Understanding the final outcomes of the deployment of resources is critical to value creation of the entity. Again, none of this appears in the financials, but there are also internal metrics that many good companies watch. Patents developed or licensed out, DVDs rented to customers, number of insurance policies sold through agents or online, and others. But as fiduciaries, one of your responsibilities is to determine what needs to be gathered, what information is critical to understand how the strategic assets are deployed, and in some way figure out what the outcomes of their investment have been. And finally, attribute 5, quantify and report the consequences of value creation of managers actively creating, preserving, or deploying strategic assets. Now, to some extent, this can be measured and reported by traditional or historic accounting and financial measures, but future cash flows and other streams of future earnings that project value creation and the attendant risk is still in its infancy. So let's keep this as the background behind our discussion of the 6 capitals, and perhaps from an economic theory and a strategic resource perspective, puts the 6 capitals in perspective of how important they are in the postmodern capitalist society. So now that we understand the basics of economic theory for studying the 6 capitals, let's take a look at the attributes of each capital as it impacts on value creation and enterprise risk of the corporate entity.